councilmen. I wanted to introduce the staff who are highly professional who will be leading the meeting. Andrew Rugg is going to be doing the presentation from the city standpoint, from the Office of Sustainable Development and Building Services. And we've got Donna Mormon here, who is an expert on this stuff and will be along to help guide whatever comes out of this. We've also got some special guests to recognize. Commissioner Ridley from the Plan Commission, I think, has joined us. Our former Plan Commissioner, Mark Reeves, is here. Former Landmark Commissioner, Mike Northrup. I saw David Preciosi from Preservation Dallas. We really appreciate you being here. I think we've got Norm Alston from Dallas Homeowners League, who's there in the back. And then our other conservation district and neighborhood association partners have joined us. Several people from the Victory Place Neighborhood Association Conservation District, In Streets East Conservation District, both sent a bunch of letters, and I think have some people here. And our friends at Lower Greenville West Neighborhood Association have joined us. So Andrew's going to take us through the process, and then we're going to have some discussion. Thanks for being here.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome, and thank you for being here tonight. This is the first pre-application meeting for the CD number 12 Belmont Addition Conservation District. Can everybody hear me all right in the back?
Yep.
Good? Okay. I just wanted to make you aware of, we do have sign-in sheets in the back, agendas. If you put your email on there, we'll add you to an interested parties list so we can keep you updated as the process goes along. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about where this process originated for potentially amending regulations in the CD12 Conservation District. So on January 10th of this year, a neighborhood committee comprising 10 property owners, and I believe we have some of the neighborhood committee members present at this meeting. You're on the neighborhood committee, please raise your hand. Okay, so these were the folks that submitted a request for pre-application meetings to our office to begin the process of potentially amending some regulations in CD number 12. So this is the first of at least 2 pre-application meetings to discuss potential amendments for CD 12. The purpose of tonight's, before I get onto that, I did want to let you all know that in 2015 the process for amending conservation districts was changed with the city code to ensure communication, encourage participation from all property owners within the CD, and that this is a neighborhood-driven process. So this request originated from the neighborhood, and this is the very first step in the process of potentially looking at amending some regulations in CD 12. So today's meeting is to inform you all as property owners within CD 12. You should have received a notice in the mail notifying you of this meeting. I'm sure the neighborhood committee has also sent out emails and flyers and those kinds of items to let you know about tonight's meeting. So we'll be going over the process of how to go about amending the conservation district. And throughout this meeting, we won't get to this second part as much in tonight's meeting, but moving forward, the process for amending will contain discussions about establishing a general list of development and architectural standards that the neighborhood would like to amend. So just a little bit of background about CD 12. The CD 12 Belmont Addition Conservation District was originally adopted by City Council in 2004, and this was established to conserve the neighborhood, to protect and enhance significant architectural and physical attributes in the CD 12 area. Here's a map, so you all are property owners, or most of you in this meeting, I would assume, are property owners within the CD 12, so here's just the boundaries as a reminder. And then a little bit about zoning history on what's gone on since the initial inception of CD 12. In 2005, City Council approved a correction ordinance to the front yard setback block averages, so Exhibit C of the current conservation district. So there was some errors in the original ordinance, so the correction ordinance was approved through City Council to correct some of those errors. In January 9th of 2019, City Council approved an amendment to the density requirements and allowed accessory dwelling units. So I believe I've seen some familiar faces from our October 2018 neighborhood meeting, as well as the city planning commission and city council meetings that did change some of the items in CD12 through an authorized hearing process. So that's a separate process of the process that is going forward today, but that did get approved at city council. Additionally, city planning commission did approve authorizing a hearing to consider amendments for driveway access. So throughout the meetings and discussions of the accessory dwelling unit zoning case, we also heard that driveway access in the conservation district, where you can only have a front access or rear access, may need to change in the future. So that'll be something that is on our authorized hearing queue. It's on our list to have an authorized hearing for that item specifically. So the process for, back to the process for amending a conservation district, which is what we're here today. So that, like I said, the neighborhood committee submitted a pre-application form to request pre-application meetings from the city. So here we're at the first pre-application meeting to discuss and establish a list of categories that the neighborhood may be interested in amending. And the topic, the way we're going to go about this is we go for broad categories on what the neighborhood may be interested in amending. So we'll get to those categories here a little bit later in the presentation. So during this process, and I think this has already occurred to some degree from the neighborhood committee, we encourage the neighborhood committee to meet with property owners to ensure awareness of the process and active participation throughout the neighborhood. So this is a neighborhood-driven process, and we want to hear from the whole neighborhood on what's working, what's not working, are there any possibilities for potential amendments that we may want to go through. The neighborhood committee and property owners should convey additional comments to staff throughout the process so we can help guide the neighborhood on getting those items that you may want to look at in the future in order for our petition language, which I'll talk about here shortly. So we'll hold additional pre-application meetings with property owners to develop and finalize categories of standards to amend and or add to the conservation district. And these categories form the basis of an amendment petition. So what we'll be focusing on, we can talk a little bit about it tonight, but really in future pre-application meetings, is to talk about the categories of things that the neighborhood may be interested in amending. So from those broad categories, the city will draft petition language with the input received throughout these pre-application meetings to draft some petition language on some broad categories that the neighborhood may be interested in amending. So what will happen after we've held these other pre-application meetings, the neighborhood committee has talked with you all about what categories, if any, you are interested in amending. The city will gather that input and draft petitions within 14 days of the last pre-application meeting. So this is the first pre-application meeting. We'll have at least one more, if not more pre-application meetings to get the general agreement of the neighborhood onto what items should be included on a petition. Then the neighborhood committee will have 15 months to get the necessary percent of signatures for those petitions. So we'll draft a petition that'll have broad categories listed on what we may be interested in amending. And then the neighborhood committee will be tasked with getting those petitions out to the property owners. And they have to get at least 58% in support of looking at these potential amendments to move this process forward. So once we've received at least 58%, and this is 58% of the land in the area or 58% of the lots, those numbers should be fairly similar with this particular conservation district, because most of the lots are similarly sized. Then staff will get those petitions back. We'll verify that the signatures are correct and that we have proper signature and documentation from at least 58% of property owners, and then that will move the process onto the post-application meetings. So just to talk a little bit about the actual petition language, the purpose of the petitions is to develop broad categories the neighborhood may want to amend. And then if those petitions are received, signed, and then received, and we as staff verify them, then we can talk about the details about those broad categories on what the neighborhood would like to amend. So here's an example. The petition language that we'll be formulating must be broad enough to allow for discussion of details, yet narrow enough to allow owners to understand what is under discussion. So, for an example, if we're talking about fences, and look at this as what would go on the petition. So, this would be too broad for a petition just to have fences as a topic of what we may want to amend. Then if we're looking at this one, this would also not work. This would be too narrow. If we said fences, proposed regulations may include adjustments to the allowed height of fences in corner side yards abutting Greenville Avenue to 10 feet. Well, that kind of tells you exactly what a potential amendment would be, and that's not what we're looking for right now. What we're looking for a potential amendment would be fences. Proposed regulations may include allowable fence height and location. So we want the petition language to be broad enough that we can further discuss at the post-application meetings what the actual amendment should be. So that's how the petition process works. So it's not agreeing to change it one way or the other, but it's agreeing to, hey, let's take a look at this as a neighborhood and decide, what we feel is the best way forward for any potential amendments. And there may not be any, even after it goes through the petition process. So again, with the petitions, the neighborhood committee will be responsible for gathering the signed petitions after the staff has drafted the petition language. And then after those petitions are verified, that's when the neighborhood committee can submit an application with appropriate fees if necessary. So that means we're holding these pre-application meetings to develop the broad categories on what the neighborhood may be interested in amending. Then we'll get the petitions out to the neighborhood committee. If they can bring back a certain percentage of petitions, that moves the process on forward. They submit an application. The fee is waived if petitions are signed by a minimum of 75% of the property owners, which we do encourage. So the two ranges are you have to have 58% at the minimum for your petitions signed and returned and verified, or if you get past 75% of all property owners, then the application fee is waived. And that's what we do encourage throughout these Conservation District amendment processes. So then once those petitions are returned, the neighborhood committee submits their application. That's when we go into the post-application phase, which is what I'll be getting to next. And in that post-application phase, that's where we talk about the actual amendments and the actual details of what the neighborhood would like to potentially amend. So yeah, after we, I think I just said that last bullet there. So the post-application process, the city will schedule neighborhood meetings to develop proposed detailed regulation in each of the petition categories. So again, this is multiple meetings held. We'll hold as many meetings that are necessary. And the neighborhood committee works to ensure all voices are heard and everyone is aware of the process. So this, again, is a neighborhood-driven process for amending a conservation district. We are here at these pre-application meetings to discuss broad categories on what you may want to amend. Then we'll have the petitions go out. If the petitions are successfully signed and verified up to the certain percentage thresholds, then we'll move on to discuss the details in post-application meetings. So after the post-application meeting, so if we get to that phase of post-application meetings, we'll get your input on the exact amendments that we are looking to propose. And then the city staff will prepare a draft ordinance and hold an additional neighborhood meeting to let you know what those amendments will be. And then after that, we'll go on to a typical zoning process. So it will go to City Plan Commission, public hearing for recommendation. The Plan Commission approves, then it moves on to City Council. And then City Council will hold a public hearing and make a final decision on the proposed amendments. So here are just some examples of what's in the CD12 regulations today. So CD12 governs these items in your current Conservation District regulations: use, accessory uses, setbacks, density, and so forth. The CD12 also has architectural standards for new construction, for remodeling, for architectural styles called out in there, different types of architectural features in each of those styles. So this is what's in there existing. So I believe you all have received a flyer from the neighborhood committee letting you know what some of their preliminary ideas are. And tonight, I think we want to hear from you what some of your ideas are for potential amendments, if they're warranted or not. We'll be getting into that here shortly. And so for next steps, and this is part of what tonight's meeting will be, is to meet and discuss the proposed categories that you're looking to amend. So we've had some preliminary ideas from the neighborhood committee regarding amending the craftsman style second floor requirements in the CD. So that could be something that we may want to amend. I believe fence height was also something including in the petition or the neighborhood committee's preliminary recommendations. The driveway access was also included in this. So those are the kind of things that we want to hear from you all on what items you may want to potentially amend or not. So the city, in the next steps, the city will schedule at least one more pre-application meeting to confirm the broad categories which will be listed on the petition. So we'll hear from you all tonight, but then after tonight's meeting, we encourage you all to meet with the neighborhood committee and further hash out what changes you would be proposing, if any, for this process to move forward. So I think we've heard some of those ideas. There may be other ideas on things that we may want to look at for potentially changing that we want to hear from you all tonight. So before I get into questions, we did receive a few questions that the neighborhood committee let us know, some of the questions that were out there already. I just wanted to sort of address a few of those. So we've really gotten to specific questions right now. We just want to emphasize the point that we're only talking about broad categories at this point. So, you know, we've had, with the proposed amendments to the craftsman specs, limit owners from building anything other than an airplane-style craftsman home. And that question really isn't applicable right now because we don't have proposed recommendations. Is that something the neighborhood may want to look at? Is craftsman architectural styles? Does that need to be looked at in the future? That's kind of those broad categories that we want to hear from you all to address. So right now, this is the very first pre-application meeting. There's some preliminary recommendations out there, but we want to hear from you all about your questions about the process, your comments about what you may want to see looked at in the future for any amendments to Conservation District 12. So with that, I'll go ahead and open up to questions, but just if you just raise your hand, I'll call on you. Let's just get one speaker at a time so we can all hear each other. And yeah, thank you for listening. And now it's your time to speak and for us to listen. So if anybody has any questions or comments, let me know. Yes, sir.
Quickly, on the March 7, 2019 hearing for an amendment regarding the driveway access,
Yes.
would that still require an amendment to actually be drafted in order to enact it? Can the city enact that for a hearing process?
So that, and let me just go back to the slide really quick. So that amendment is essentially in the queue right now. So City Planning Commission has authorized a hearing to consider amendments for driveway access. So that's in our authorized hearings list. We have a bunch of other authorized hearings on top of that, so we don't have a specific time frame for when that would actually be heard.
But that amendment has been drafted in their draft language, like similar to the process?
There's not draft language for it yet. It's just up for consideration.
Consideration of the ability to amend the driveway access.
Right.
So subsequent to that consideration, that hearing, you would need to then have the language drafted, and then you would all be approving that language?
So
I'm just trying to determine if that process is similar to the process we're now going through.
It's a different process.
Okay.
So there's two ways to amend Conservation District. This is the neighborhood-driven process. The authorized hearing process is called by City Planning Commission or City Council. So they have the ability to authorize a hearing where we'll look at a specific regulation or set of regulations in an area.
Okay,
Yep.
thanks.
Are you taking questions on the process now, or can we give questions?
Questions and comments, I'll get you next. Let me get this gentleman in the back first.
I wasn't clear from your presentation. Who drafts the petition? Is it the committee or is it the city staff?
So the city staff will ultimately be drafting the petition, but we are hearing, the committee and the neighbors in these neighborhood meetings will be telling us what broad categories they would like to have included. So say fences is one broad category, and then maybe fence height and location is what you're looking at, and we will take that and put that into the petition format. Say there's another one, retaining walls, and say those are, no one wants to mess with retaining walls. Some say, I want retaining walls, and others say, don't mess with retaining walls, this is fine how it is, and if there's not a general agreement about pushing that forward, then that would not be included on the petition language.
How do you establish general agreement?
That'll be gathered from these meetings, so we will try to establish general agreement. It would behoove the neighborhood committee to have items on the petition that they can have the support to move forward. So if there is something that people don't generally agree on, then that probably would not be something they would want to include on the petition.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I just wanted to talk about special exceptions, would this be the time to do it?
Yes.
I bought my Craftsman home in 1987. It was a little two-bedroom, single bath Craftsman home. And I was very, very pleased when the Conservation District came in, because I was trying to get out of Plano. And Plano was coming back to me. So when the Conservation District came out, I was very pleased. In 2010, I decided to renovate my house. And the house had been remodeled prior to my purchase, and the existing house had, I'm giving you an example of a special exception. I'm sorry I can tell you that. But the existing rat tails on my house were 20 inches long and had 4-inch gutters on them. And I assume that what had happened is they have these little decorative curlicues on the rat tails. I think they cut those off and just put the gutters on. So the final length was 20 inches plus 4 inches. I had a 24-inch overhang. So I submitted my plans to the city, drew them up myself. And I guess they like to emphasize what they're trying to show you. He said, roof overhang, leave a minimum 24-inch, not including gutter. Well, that's a simple statement. It's easy for him to say. But I went to a lot of trouble to mill 117 board, make this house look exactly like the original house. I didn't want it to look like there was a hat on it. So the difference in the eaves are the downslopes there. 24-inch to 20-inch. When you come to the corner of the house where you're trying to build it, made a real problem for the framers. And I could have probably petitioned the city for a special exception, but the process is not easy for the Belmont district. For the Vickery Place district, it is. You have a really neat little paragraph in there where if you have a special exception like this, like I had in my case, you can petition. They will send out a letter to every house within 200 feet of your house. And if nobody has a problem with it, then it's more likely the director.
That's not true for the Vickery Place. I think you're talking about the Board of Adjustments, maybe? No.
It's in your ordinance. It's a paragraph about that long. I'll spec number 19. I show it to you.
And just to,
but you guys, you know this better than the process in there. You send out 200 feet of each house with your problem, and then people make a input if they don't like it or they like it. It's right there. I'll show it to you.
yeah, it's a board of adjustment process.
Yeah, it's in there.
And yeah, it is an appeals process. And
Well,
then,
thank you, that's all I had.
Thank
I wanted to show
Thank you.
and I just want to,
We'd like to have special exceptions added to the Belmont edition, similar to what Victory Place has. Thank you.
right, and just to, on that note, with the special exceptions, I believe with special exceptions, you have to call out specifically what the exception would be, but that could be something that we could potentially look into, and it could be as part of these amendments, so that could be an example. To the Board of Adjustment, yes. And the other thing that I did want to point out, and then I'll get you next, sir, is this process, and what we also want to hear about today is maybe there's some common issues with the Conservation District that could be fixed through this amendment process. So I think reading through the language, it's a pretty well-written document, the Conservation District right now, but there are some issues that come up, and they could come up persistently. So those are the kinds of things that can be amended and remedied throughout this process. So I just wanted to throw that out there. Yes, sir.
Back to the process of it, once the city has developed the petition based on these meetings, I just want to clarify that in case anybody is confused, so correct me if I'm wrong. It's an all or nothing petition, right? So once it goes out and you get one vote, it's not a line item.
Correct.
So
Yeah.
the more items that are on it, if somebody finds one particular thing objectionable and they don't know, then they're less likely to go through.
Right. That is
So,
correct.
it is an all or nothing petition.
Right. Yeah. It's you can sign it or not sign it, and the neighborhood committee, in this instance, because of the number of lots that are in the conservation district, our code gives you the neighborhood committee 15 months to gather the necessary petitions. Yes.
How long in between petitions can you file? So if we have, let's say there's 4 items, but 2 people feel strongly on, 2 people really don't, can you file a petition just for those 2 first, and then file another petition a month later for the other 2? Or what's
No.
the time period in between?
Yeah, so the petition process and what we're trying to establish with the petition process is broad categories that the neighborhood is interested in amending. So we want to get those broad categories on a petition, just one petition. So if there's some items on that are, we talk about in these meetings, but some, maybe there's not going to be support for one of the items on there, then I probably wouldn't recommend including that particular item to potentially be up for discussion in the post-application meetings. Yes, ma'am.
So I understand the special use idea, but how do you reconcile that with the defeats we've had with fighting builders totally lambasting what we have in place and fighting the city? Like, how do we protect it and make sure that the things we think are reasonable go through and the things we don't? I mean, I know there's no be all end all, but that's a question I have. That we've struggled with holding on to what we already fought so, or actually people before we worked so hard to put in place, and then how do we make sure we hold on to that with this kind of nebulous idea?
Yeah, well, so I think this is more geared towards issues that people have with the current regulations, and then making solutions that will still keep the character and the spirit and intent of the conservation district will remain. I think that's the intent on staff, and I think would be the intent for the neighborhood in general, is the fixes that you are potentially looking at will still keep the spirit and intent of the Conservation District 12 regulations intact. So it may be something with gutters or fence height that you want to add, but something that won't detract and open it up for development that you don't want. So I think that's what I can say on that.
Yeah, but my understanding was the proposal is to change certain specific things and then have this catch-all at the end. So I'm more wanting to know about the catch-all.
So I guess the catch-all is at the beginning of the process. So we're talking about broad categories on what we might want to amend. And then from there, after the petition has gone through, that's when we discuss the details of those broad categories. And when we discuss those details, that's exactly what we'll be discussing is what do we want, if we make this change to X, will that still, keep the spirit of the intent and the conservation district alive and well, but fix some of the issues that we're having?
All right, so you're looking for a front to back detailed proposal for change?
Yes. Mhm. Yes, sir.
Yes.
Oh,
Are you calling on me? Are you calling on me?
let's get this gentleman up here and then we'll get you, Barry.
Yeah, I'd like to discuss briefly enforcement of the regulations specifically for general repairs to existing structures and why we don't have a grandfather clause in here that will allow people to make simple repairs of their property without having to go through the same process a builder would have to do to put up a new house. That's just,
I think we have, I think part of being in a conservation district is to submit that work review to ensure that you're meeting the regulations in the conservation district. So I guess you're.
it's a huge log jam.
Uh-huh.
There's not enough people in the office to do the paperwork. And when you want to repaint your front door, there's an inspector who comes around and puts a red tag on you because you didn't get a permit, which is not a permit. It's an okay, but it's not a permit. I'd like them to clarify that and simplify the process.
Thank you. Barry, let's get
Yes.
you.
I just wanted to point out, like DW, one of our proposed changes that we'd like to make, our solutions, is with the front yard setbacks. And the correction that we see, we completely agree with the homes, the pre-1946 homes being set back from the property line, an average of the block face. But what I found out through our research is that my particular house, and every original house on my block, I had a survey done, and all of the setbacks are completely wrong. The average for my block is 4.42 feet that they're chopping off the front of the houses because of the way that the city interprets front yard setbacks. Front facade is a little ambiguous, but the city considers your front facade as the first time that anything attached to your property, including my front porch and my stairs, is higher than 6 inches off the ground. Well, I don't have front stairs at this point. I don't have the front 1.5 feet of my porch at this point. If the city regulates it one way and it was written another way. So that's one of the small solutions that we're looking to improve in the neighborhood. And I mean, I spent the money, I had a survey done. There's one lady here, Amanda, they're cutting off 10 feet from the front of the house.
Full front porch.
She has no front porch.
This has been there forever.
So that's, I just wanted to make that point. Really invest in the conservation district and not destroy it.
I think it's interesting on this point too, is I bet if you walk around, it's a gargantuan task to measure everyone's house. Where the committee's looking at electronic solutions to solve for that, so people can actually find out, am I in the setback? My house is probably the oldest house in this neighborhood, if not one. It's from 1911. It's reported as far as back in 1895. So it really bothered me the other day when I measured. I actually looked at my plat, did the measurements, and helped with Barry actually, because I'm not all that great at it, he is. And I found out that the original columns on that house, I live at Belmont and Matilda on the corner, so a big gray house. Those columns are in the setback. So if you're like 8 my columns, more than 25% of them, theoretically, I would have to move them back, and then the front part of my house would fall off. So this is nonsense. All my steps are in the setback. How is that possible that one of the oldest houses would be in this condition? By the way, I shot a laser down one of my neighbor's properties. They didn't even know that they are also in the setback. So to me, this is a ticking time bomb that can impact people with, in my case, that would be probably $30,000, $40,000 worth of work to structurally change my house, going against the whole purpose we're here for, which is to protect the copyright of the house.
That's not how repairs work. Andrew, you're gonna need to explain to him how this actually works. If you set setbacks to an average, you're necessarily going to have original houses that are farther forward than the average, because that's how averages work. And if you have termite damage to the front of your house, you're allowed to repair it regardless of whether you're in the setback or not.
That's not correct.
That's 100% true.
And my only point is that every single original house in my block is this way. And my house, the way the city measures it, is 33.5 feet. So the first time it's more than 6 inches off the ground. When the conservation, when Rob Talley went out and measured it, you guys put it at 44. And then what happened is that he was measuring to the sidewalks. And then you guys said, no, we have to measure to the property line. So what that was is y'all went through and said, well, how far behind the sidewalk is the property line? 4 feet is what was defined. Mine's still there, I haven't moved the sidewalk nor the property line, and it's 5 feet. Okay, and then when you start averaging this stuff out, they said, well, the next time you guys come out, you said, well, we'll just add that 4 feet to the setback. Well, when you add 4 feet to the front yard setback, that pushes it into my living room. That's why it was amended in 2005, because you subtracted the 4 feet plus another 4 feet. And so that's my,
Yeah, so that's, I mean,
that's
that's
the
an
problem
example.
that we're running into.
Yeah, that's an
The
example of
city
what
can
could be
measure
in
that, no
that.
problem.
Rob Talley did, and I've got the information.
Okay, let's get, I have a question back here. Let's get Pam.
I haven't moved the street nor my property.
So if you're in the middle of one of these processes, is there any reprieve? Like, I just got a notice the other day that my fence is unacceptable. So given that, you know, like that's something to be dealt with, can we get a reprieve so that we're not like tearing things down and that
So-
a year later are gonna be acceptable?
So, Bill, you wanted to.
I'm Bill Hirsch, I'm the chief planner with the conservation districts. The way that works, if we have ongoing violations or what might be violations out there, we're in a process that's really iffy. We have no idea if this is going to pass, if everybody's going to agree on the same thing. Right now, the regulations are what they are. And so if you're in violation, you get a certain amount of time in order to rectify that issue. And we can't have a violation sitting around for a year or more while we hope that something gets pushed through the process. And so if you've been given a citation of some type, you really still need to address it. We're going to have to address it even in that period. And I know it doesn't sound good, because what if you address it and then now that regulation gets changed to the equipment we're treating everybody here equally, process or not, you know?
I think we have to talk about that more, because you can say address it, but address it can be a huge undertaking and a very expensive undertaking, and something that makes your house much less attractive and functional than it was before.
I agree with there's a violation with some type of regulation, I guess with your case would be a fence regulation, is that correct?
Fence is too high.
So the fence is too high, it was constructed too high. We're gonna go address that the same way we would for any other conservation district or any PD or NSO or historic district, no matter what is going on. We just can't have violations sitting out. That's more of a function of the code enforcement, that type of stuff, but that's the way they look at it. This is a process that's really just at the beginning, and we can't have a year while we let all these violations stay in place, just on the hopes that this goes through. And so we have to address it.
Ma'am?
It's unfortunate. We do feel weird.
So then a follow-up with the process, just to clarify the timeline, what's the quickest time frame this could all happen in, and what's the worst case?
Well, it's really dependent on the neighborhood committee and the neighborhood in general. So what the next step is agreeing on some items that you would like to see included as broad categories that what you'd like to amend. So we've heard a few things, front yard setback issues, fence issues, special exceptions, the general repairs in the conservation districts, and those could be some topics to explore further when the neighborhood committee and the neighbors meet together. And you had what was the second part of your question?
Just kind of give a
timeline,
time frame
that's right.
of
Right, so what the,
person.
So it's up to the neighbors and the neighborhood committee, this is a neighborhood-driven process, to come up with this broad categories, and then the city will schedule additional pre-application meetings. There's the time frame for 15 months for the neighborhood committee to get the necessary petitions. If they submit them before, it's up to the neighborhood committee. They just have a deadline, not if you turn it in a month later, that will work too. So it's really dependent on those factors.
So you can speed it up.
Yes.
What was that 15-month issue?
So the 15 months is the deadline. So you have the neighborhood committee.
And once you file, it starts the process.
Right, exactly. Once we give the neighborhood committee the petitions, that starts the clock, and you have 15 months to gather the necessary petitions. And if you're at 16 months, then there's no longer a process. It's not going forward. Yes, sir.
I lost you on the disparity between the existing process we're discussing and the sort of other process that exists for like the driveways.
Yes.
Can you clarify the difference of those two?
Sure, yeah. So what I explained earlier, and I'll just try and recap that, is this is the Conservation District amendment process, the neighborhood-driven process. The other process was an authorized hearing. So the authorized hearing process is called for by City Plan Commission or City Council to look at specific regulations. So that's the other process. We had the meeting here in October. That was for the authorized hearing process. And then that ultimately went through to City Council and was approved. Hayden?
Does the authorized hearing process requires neighborhood petition signatures in all the neighborhoods to sign the petition?
There's not a petition process in the authorized hearing like you did recently. There is a reply form that's sent out that the Plan Commission and City Council will take into consideration.
But it's not a vote.
Right, it's a reply form, so it's for consideration of whatever's being proposed.
And with this process, there is a vote. Because everybody has to sign 58 or 75%.
It's also not a vote, it's a petition process, but yes, you have to get the necessary support in petitions. Yes, sir.
It's called the Conservation District. I haven't seen anything conservative. Tearing nice houses down, cutting the trees down, and building the mansions with 2 or 3 people in it. And I signed for this deal because I thought it was going to eliminate this. They come around and I said, yeah. So anyway, I don't say anything conservative. It's called the Conservation District. We're not conserving anything.
And to those,
All regulations and setbacks and, oh, it's the wrong color paint and those windows, where are you getting those windows at? Then you go down there, it might take forever just to do okay. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you.
I've lived at the corner of Belmont and Concho for 30 years, and before the Conservation District came into being, I had the distinction of having my 2 houses photographed as exactly what people thought we should do, and one that we should tear down immediately. One that was exactly what we should do was taking my prairie-style house and turning it into a Tudor-style house. It's 2 stories. I've got a gravel courtyard in the front, and I had a design that had retaining walls around the front yard, some steps up to the house, and I have a circular drive that goes from my gravel court to the sidewalk, but I've never been able to take it to the street. And so I would like to ask that we consider circular drives as one of the things that we talk about. I know most people don't like it. I know people want parking off the front, but it's done. I have a gravel courtyard. It's going to be that way. It's never going away. So to not be able to exit to the street out the other side seems ridiculous. So in part, I'd like to sort of support the idea of some ideas of special exceptions or grandfathering or something like that. But I'd like to say in general that when I voted for the Conservation District, and I did in 2004, it was because I think most of us were bummed out about our houses being torn down and replaced with McMansions. I think that was the prevailing sentiment of the time. And like this gentleman, I feel like what we got was excessive regulation, kind of a destruction of creativity. You can't be, all sorts of features of my Tudor house do not meet the scheme of Tudor exactly. I feel like I moved here because it was a creative and vibrant neighborhood with a lot of house styles. I moved here from Boston, I like Boston. And what we've done inadvertently is we have given the builders in the prairie-style two-story, cement-sided, poorly detailed prairie-style house the cheapest house possible. It's replacing, like this man said, nothing's conserved. All we're doing is getting a uniformity of two-story prairie-style houses that are badly built.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, sir.
Okay, so when it comes to, when we created the conservation district, where did these rules come from? Was it with an architectural review board? Because I agree with him, like I feel like to do something that's like a Craftsman or like a Prairie, when there's more regulations for people that are keeping the architectural integrity of their house, to do an addition or to change something on it, it's harder for you to do it with the original home than if somebody just comes in and knocks it down and builds a brand new house. Like, that's how they've gotten around it, where the rest of the neighborhood is trying to fit within it. And who created these rules? Was it something that we looked at another conservation or historic era and said, oh, this is what they've done and we're gonna apply it to our neighborhood? Like, how did that go about?
It was a combination of many things. It was done with I believe, also a neighborhood process, where the neighborhood in 2002, 2003 time frame came together and and drafted a list of what they would like to put into regulations for the conservation district. So I believe that's how the process happened back in 2003 or so. Yes, ma'am.
But just out of curiosity, to piggyback on that, who in this room, if you don't mind raising your hand, was part of that drafting process, the original process? Okay, so maybe these are people that people could talk to about the original process too?
Right, yeah. I wasn't here at that.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
So when we're gonna look at this process, and we can say, you know, we can pick and choose what we want to change. Some things we might want to leave the same, some things we may be, the group may be interested in changing. When we go through this process, are there things that the city will require us to include? Regulations, guidance has changed since we first started this, so as we open up the language, are there things that the city is going to say, well, you have to have, if you're going to do that, you have to have this, and if you're going to do that, you have to have that. And so then it becomes spiraling, and so we're then become sort of accepting things maybe that we didn't put forward to accept.
So on that, we'll have the broad categories like you were talking about, and then say we get to the petitions and we're in the post-application phase, and that's where we talk about the actual details on what you would like to see amended. And we'll work with the neighborhood to help craft those regulations that you want to have, and then also work for the city that we have, you know, in other conservation districts, or that we can enforce in a conservation district. So that post-application phase is where we work with you all to determine what exactly it is you want to see. So what you want to protect, regulate, maybe if you don't want something in there, you know, that could all be potentially
But the city sorry, Margaret. So because we say, okay, let's just say one of the proposed changes is about the Craftsman setback. Okay, we want to change that. The neighborhood decides that. Well, when you change that, the city said, not that we say we want to change this as a broad category, but then you come in and say, okay, to do that, blah, 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 and like, I'm not a lawyer, so forgive me for, forgive me, but I think the bylaw, I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express. So like, you know, when contracts are opened up, you know, then that opens the opportunity then for other things to get sort of tacked on that maybe weren't originally intended with the proposed changes. So does the city then have regulations that sort of kind of, okay, well, now we're doing this for conservation districts, so you've opened it up and boom, you've got to have all this other
So
stuff.
the purpose of the petition is to only talk about the categories that we're interested in changing. So we can't get to the post-application phase and say, oh, well, maybe if we think about changing something we didn't originally agree to talk about,
But it's not
We can't-
going to be
we can't change
limited,
that.
and we have control of that, going door to door, getting signatures, is not now limited to what we ask. Is that what you're saying?
so
So
that
like, you put forth a petition, you say, these are the 5 things we want to change, and if people sign off on that, does that mean when you go through this process, they could add, to Michelle's point, you could add on to that, open the door?
No.
Or is it going to be limited to what people sign off on, we can go door to door?
Yes, so it is, the petitions would be limited, well, so moving
Is
forward in
that-
the process.
Because if you open one, will it open?
No, so the petitions are just for what categories you're interested in looking at, and those are the only things that you can amend in the post-application phase, which is still a discussion amongst the neighborhood on what the details of that amendment may be.
But can the city open it up after that, because we've asked for X, Y, and Z, and they decided if you ask for X, Y, and Z, you should have A, B, C.
But not as part of the neighborhood-driven conservation district amendment process. Philip?
Yeah, Andrew, go back to your slide where you explain the petition language. I thought you had a good example.
Okay.
Okay, so the example of the language in the petition, the language that would go out if we decide to put fences in the petition is the just right one, the Goldilocks one at the bottom. Proposed regulations may include allowable fence height and location. That doesn't tell you what will be in the ordinance. That gets decided at the post-application meetings, and it could be whatever people show up at the post-application meetings want to put in there, which means it could be 4-foot fences, 10-foot fences. You have no idea when you're doing the petition what the actual outcome will be. So there is actually some variation that is likely to happen post-petition, if petitions can actually be gathered. It's kind of a lot.
Yes, ma'am.
But of course, I can tell you the purpose of this, and being a committee member, is we want everybody in this room to stay involved in this process. We don't want everyone who's in here coming to this first meeting and then kind of throwing your hands up, and then a petition goes out, and then you're not part of the process of these details. Okay, this is neighborhood driven. We want to see as many people involved in the details as possible.
And yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I just want to put out kind of, I guess it's a personal opinion about the CD affecting losing some of the historic structures in the neighborhood. My husband and I lived in a 1913 bungalow. 3 years ago, we spent a ridiculous amount of money doing a huge renovation on the home. On our block, we've also lost several bungalows. One of them was torn down like 4 weeks ago. When we originally started the process to renovate our home, our foundation was Bodark stumps and concrete cinder blocks. That it was on the original, I mean, there were 1913 Bodark stumps that were holding up our house. When we went to the engineer, the original bid that we got to put an actual foundation, and we took core samples to find bedrock underneath our house, it's 12 feet down on the 5800 block of Goliad. The original bid to sink 40 piers 12 feet down was $60,000. And we wound up doing some rejiggering and doing some other things, but we still spent about $45,000 putting a real honest-to-God foundation on that house so that it's going to last another 100 years. Part of the problem with these old homes, and our house we bought it in 2006, was owned by a pair of architects who had already done really lovingly, historically accurate conservation on the house. The houses in our neighborhood that have been turned down, like they're crack houses. I mean, they're really in bad condition. when people have moved out of these homes, and Blaine and I have gone next door or 2 doors down, I've been appalled that there were people actually living in these homes. I mean, there was nothing that you could do but tear them down because they're in such bad condition. So I don't believe that the CD has contributed to losing any of these homes. The problem with losing some of these homes is that it's 100 years of neglect. And this is our 4th historic home. And we made a gigantic 6-figure commitment to saving this home. But not everybody's willing to do that. And the CD has absolutely nothing to do with that.
Yes, sir.
My comment on that, and so, we moved from Lano in, which we bought in 2007, and just tore down a house on Belmont, and built in a prairie style house for all those out there who want to know.
It was one of those homes that
And part of my comment is that there are a lot of houses through our neighborhood that do not have another generation to live in. They just don't. And that is part of the acceptance of 100-year-old houses are not always salvageable. And our house that we are living in today was not salvageable. It was an old duplex that had been very poorly neglected for probably 20-some years. And our process of wanting to build a house in the conservation district that we've lived in since '07 was very painful. We wanted a craftsman-style house. We had lived in a craftsman-style house. We love the neighborhood for craftsman-style houses. I understand there's other houses out there too. So no offense to those who don't live in a craftsman-style house, but it was what we wanted. But we also have 3 children and 3 boys. And the idea of putting a house and keeping the restrictions of the conservation district of the 2nd story just did not work for us. So we built a prairie style house, which is what just about everyone else seems to do, because from a footprint management on the lots, it seems to work best for maximizing your square footage, minimizing the amount of space that you're taking on the lots. Most of our lots aren't giant, and so trying to keep a pool in the backyard, or what we decided to do was just have a backyard for our kids to play in. And that was part of the issue that we moved from Lano over to Belmont, was our backyard did not work for our children. And so that was, that's our personal story of trying to build a craftsman-style house in the conservation district and ending up with a prairie-style house that I do personally believe is very beautiful. But not exactly what we wanted.
But not what we intended.
And not what we intended.
We wanted a craftsman home. We wanted to keep with the tradition of the neighborhood. We wanted to rebuild a home that would be there for another 100 years in a similar style, and just weren't able to make it work for our family. Sure, we could have pushed out the first floor so that we had 70% on the second, but then we would have lost our backyard for our kids, and it wasn't workable.
Thank you all. Yes, sir.
So if we're trying to fix things that are broken with the tools and information, is there information that we can get as a tool to use? For example, violations, not people's names or anything like that. But can we get a list of the violations that have occurred over the years? Can we also get a list of the applications that have been denied? For whatever reason, and it could be that the language is poor in the application, it could be something that we need to pay attention to as a part of our process. And then I'd also like to see a show of hands the individuals that live in the conservation district because they want to live in the conservation district.
Because you want to live in a conservation
I think we can provide that data to you. I'd also encourage the neighborhood committee and the neighbors to meet and talk about kind of what we've heard a little bit tonight, those experiences on what you feel may need to change, what you may need to amend in the regulations to make them work while still keeping certain regulations to ensure that this is still a viable conservation district and does have certain restrictions that, just generally speaking, limit people from building big mansions is kind of the main thing that we generally hear with conservation districts. But trying to balance out those rules and regulations so you have the ability as homeowners to do what you want to do, but also to serve the entire neighborhood where certain architectural styles will still be present and that will still be applicable in the neighborhood.
I guess the only editorial that I would also offer, being an architect, is that this is a conservation district. It's not a historic district. We're not in the preservation business of putting things back the way they were. We're trying to maintain the beauty and the aura of the neighborhood the way it exists as close as we can, and taking into account the exceptions that have to be taken because of style and the ability to work within a platform of 4 homes that are part of the conservation district rules. And so I think at this point we're trying to work through those, and I think that's important. But again, I think we're trying to fix things that are broken. We're going to have to identify what is actually broken, as opposed to looking at individuals' applications for requests for relief from violations and things like that. And we need to pay attention and make sure that the conservation district maintains a conservation district approach to doing business.
Absolutely. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to add some color to your story. I think it's playing out over and over again in the neighborhood. So since 2004, when the conservation district was established, we've lost 73 homes. They changed style since that point. 59 of those homes were craftsman homes. So we've lost 54 homes, and 54 beautiful prairie homes have been put in its place. So what we're seeing is that exact scenario. We have a lot of folks that want to live in this area to be in a conservation district, but they're not able to get the square footage out of an existing platform. Much like the house that's being torn down on Palo Pinto, the builder's pretty much leaving the shell of the house, but they can't put a second story on there to get the square footage without encroaching on the backyard that would take up play space or pool space. And so folks are opting to build the prairie style, which gives them square footage on that small platform. So again, we've lost 59 craftsmen and 54 prairies have been built into place. So I think that's playing out over and over.
I guess my question is, I guess I know a craftsman house when I see it, but what defines it, and why can't they go up?
It's part of,
There's architects in here, and maybe you can answer that.
So, Bill, we have can you talk to the craftsman style regulation in this particular conservation district?
Okay, yeah.
The second story, one meeting.
So currently, if you have a craftsman style house, if you're going to construct a craftsman style house, the second plane of the plane of the second floor has to be set back 5 feet from the plane of the first floor. That's not including your porch, that's the actual plane of the house. And also the floor area can't exceed 70% of the floor area that's on the first floor. I wasn't around when this provision was written, so I don't quite know exactly what the methodology was behind it, but it sounds like what they were trying to do is an airplane bungalow, which is a very typical type of craftsman style that has a smaller footprint on the second floor than it does on the first floor. That is not the be-all end-all for craftsman styles. I've seen craftsman styles that are straight plane 2 stories. The majority of them are not that way. The straight plane would be like a prairie style. What you normally see are maybe a portion of it with the plane with lots of setbacks, nested gables, bays that extend. You may have breaks in the actual building itself. So that's what you guys have to figure out what's right for your district for the craftsman style.
And that's currently allowed to be set back 5 feet.
It has to be. It has to be set back.
But it's only on the front facade, correct? It only has to set back on the front facade.
On the front facade, not on the sides, right.
I know, but I'm just saying, it doesn't have to be an airplane, because an
It
airplane
doesn't have to be an
typically.
airplane, no. We've approved many that don't have that. The way that it works is think about your district and where you live, and think of it separately than other districts in the city. So what works in Munger Place, what works in Swiss Avenue, doesn't have the same architectural context as what the Belmont addition may have. So what I suggest is, if this is something you guys want to revise, go out, do a survey of all the craftsman style structures, which there are a lot here, that are possibly 2-story, and look for the commonalities among them. And that might be what you guys need to shoot for. But airplane one was one where I got like 50 questions.
So I was on the original group that formed the conservation district. We spent about at least 3 years researching everything in the neighborhood, looking at the existing houses, which were primarily bungalows, very few prairies. We worried that if we had it overly broad and loose as far as what people could build, we'd end up with the kind of houses that we got now. The lots are fairly small. They range from 50 feet wide to anywhere from, I guess, 150 to 105 feet deep. My daughter and I actually, who's now an architect, did the measurements of the setback, looking at the actual property lines, using a magnet and laser and all that. Those lots are only designed for a house that's under 3,000 square feet. All of the original houses are in that size, and people are cramming Plano-sized houses into those lots. That's been the agenda from the very beginning, and that's what we wanted to prevent. When we started writing the ordinance, we had that in there. The city watered certain things down, so there were loopholes that builders found. They looked for very, they pushed the envelope in every possible way. We had to fight with builders on numerous occasions who violated the rules. Just for example, a Tudor needs to be 1.5 stories tall. That means that the second story needs to be fully encased in the second, needs to be encased in the roof line. A builder violated that. I was actually on the 6 o'clock news pointing it out. But the city didn't enforce it. And that's been the problem from the get-go, that the rules were not written as tightly as they needed to be, and the city has not consistently enforced. They haven't demolished, I think, maybe one house that was very oddly, well, no, I don't think anything in our district has ever been demolished. I don't think the city has ever required a builder to take down a house that was non-compliant. We've had all kinds of bizarre things being built that they get away with it. And that's the problem.
That's my concern with the special use, is we've had so many lawsuits with the city. How are we gonna prevent this more vague language to not just let them do this?
Well, yeah, we ultimately can come up with detailed language. Yes. Oh, yeah.